Good evening. I'm Joseph Dobrian. On tonight's show, I'm going to pay tribute to the man I think is probably the wisest public figure in America today, a man named Dr. Thomas Sowell. That's S-O-W-E-L-L, if you haven't heard of him. He's a famous sociologist, author, pedagogue, and just generally all-around smart guy. He is retiring. He's 86 years old now, and he's stepping back from his various duties in order to focus on writing his memoirs and wrapping up his life. So I thought that this would be an excellent time to read a few of his shorter articles to give the public an idea of what a terrific guy this fellow is, at least in my opinion. Dr. Thomas Sowell has been on the scene politically and sociologically for a good many years now, and he's generally regarded as a conservative. I would call him more of a classical liberal. But whatever way you want to classify him, he's awfully smart and he's worth reading, worth listening to. I'm going to start this show by reading an article that he wrote immediately after the late presidential election, which I think is especially apropos since we are now entering a new administration. This is Dr. Thomas Sowell speaking here. As the transition period between administrations begins, Donald Trump and the Republican establishment must take time for self-reflection. The good news is that we dodged a bullet in this election. The bad news is that we don't know how many other bullets are coming or from what direction. A Hillary Clinton victory would have meant a third consecutive administration dedicated to dismantling the institutions that have kept America free and imposing instead the social vision of the smug elites. That could have been the ultimate catastrophe, not just for our time, but for generations yet unborn. In one sense, Donald Trump's victory was a unique American event. But in a larger sense, it represents the biggest backlash among many elsewhere against smug elites in Western nations, where increasing numbers of ordinary people are showing their anger at where those elites are leading their countries. There, as here, mindlessly flinging the doors open to peoples from societies whose fundamental values clash with those of the countries they enter has been a hallmark of arrogant blindness and disregard of negative consequences suffered by ordinary people, consequences from which the elites themselves are insulated. Nor is this the only issue on which the blindness of elites has set the stage for a political backlash. The anti-law enforcement fetish among the insulated elites has even more tragically sacrificed the safety of the general public. This, too, has been common on both sides of the Atlantic. Riots in London, Manchester, and other cities in England in 2011 were incredibly similar to 2014 riots in Ferguson, Missouri, 2015 riots in Baltimore, and similar riots in other American cities. The fact that the rioters in England were mostly white, while those in America were mostly black, gives the lie to the facile excuse that such riots are due to racial oppression, rather than being a result of appeasing mobs and restricting the police. Nor is the election of Donald Trump likely to lead the elites to having second thoughts about the prevailing dogmas of their groupthink. On the morning after Mr. Trump's upset victory over Mrs. Clinton, a newswoman at CNN mentioned the disappointment of some women that the quote-unquote glass ceiling was not shattered as expected. What an insult to everyone's intelligence is that catchphrase, glass ceiling. What does glass mean if not that you cannot see the ceiling, but somehow you just know that it's there? And how do you know? Because it has been repeated so often. It's like the fable of the emperor's new clothes, but a fable for adults. Demagogues like Hillary Clinton can point to the fact that women as a group do not receive as much income as men as a group, But factual studies over the past 40 years have shown repeatedly that when you compare women who work as many hours a year as men and as many continuous years in the same occupation as men, the income differences shrink to the vanishing point and sometimes even reverse. But how many politicians or media people care about facts when the facts go against their preconceptions? Donald Trump's unexpected victory should send a lot of people back to the drawing board to rethink their assumptions about many things. That includes not only the political left, but also the Republican establishment. But don't count on it. The Republican establishment has been called many things, but introspective is not one of them. One thing they might reconsider is their assumption that they alone know just what kind of presidential candidate is needed to win elections. But the two most surprisingly successful Republican candidates of the past half-century, Ronald Reagan and now Donald Trump, bore no resemblance to the candidates who epitomized the Republican establishment's model, such as Bob Dole, John McCain, and Mitt Romney. Among others who could also use some rethinking is Donald Trump himself. When he acted like a petulant adolescent, he may have gotten the adulation of his core constituents, but it was only toward the end, when he began to act like a responsible adult seeking the highest office in the land, that he began to overtake Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump is a wild card. We don't know whether he was play acting when he carried on like a juvenile lout or when he played the role of a mature adult. But he and the country could both benefit from some serious introspection on his part. Now here is the same Dr. Thomas Sowell talking about gun control, one of the more cogent articles I've seen on the subject. Here is Dr. Sowell again. Liberals imagine that law-abiding citizens do not have any idea how to use a gun responsibly, and that criminals will start following rules. Sometimes someone inadvertently performs a public service by bringing an unbelievably stupid and dangerous idea to the surface where it can be exposed for what it is. The New York Times can be credited, if that is the word, with performing this public service in a recent editorial against proposals to allow law-abiding citizens to carry concealed guns. They refer to what they call the National Rifle Association's, quote, fantasy that citizens can stand up to gunmen by shooting it out, unquote. Nobody has suggested any such thing. Data collected over many years, but almost never seeing the light of day in the New York Times or the rest of the mainstream media, show that many thousands of examples of people defending themselves with a gun each year without having to pull the trigger. If someone comes at you with a knife and you pull out a gun, chances are they will stop. The only time I ever pointed a gun at a human being, it was when someone was sneaking up toward me from behind a shed in the middle of the night. I never fired a shot. I just pointed the gun at him and told him to stop. He stopped. Actually, having to shoot someone is the exception, not the rule. Yet the New York Times conjures up a vision of something like the gunfight at the OK Corral. Concealed guns protect not only those who carry them, but also those who do not. If concealed guns become widespread, then a mugger or a carjacker has no way of knowing who has one and who does not. It makes sense being a mugger or a carjacker. It makes being a mugger or a carjacker a less safe occupation. Gun control laws are in effect occupational safety laws. OSHA for burglars, muggers, carjackers, and others. The fatal fallacy of gun control laws in general is the assumption that such laws actually control guns. Criminals who disobey other laws are not likely to be stopped by gun control laws. What such laws actually do is increase the number of disarmed and defenseless victims. Who puts a stop to mass shootings? usually the arrival on the scene of someone else with a gun. Mass shootings are often used as examples of a need for gun control, but what puts a stop to mass shootings? Usually the arrival on the scene of somebody with a gun. Mass shooters are often portrayed as irrational people engaged in senseless acts, but mass shooters are usually rational enough to attack schools, churches, and other places where there is far less likelihood of someone on the scene who is armed. Seldom do we hear about these irrational shooters engaging in senseless attacks on meetings of the National Rifle Association or a local gun show or a National Guard armory. The fallacy of believing that the way to reduce shootings is to disarm peaceful people extends from domestic gun control laws to international disarmament agreements. If disarmament agreements reduced the dangers of war, there would never have been a World War II. The decades leading up to that war were filled with international disarmament agreements. As with domestic gun control laws, the agreements were followed by peaceful countries and ignored by belligerent countries that built up huge war machines, such as in Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The net result was that the belligerent countries had every incentive to start wars, and that they inflicted devastating losses on the peaceful countries that had drastically curtailed their own military forces. Eventually, the Western democracies got their act together and turned things around after they belatedly beefed up their military forces. But thousands of lives were lost needlessly before that happened. World War II was in its third year before Western forces won a single battle. Undaunted by history, the same kind of thinking that had cheered international disarmament treaties in the 1920s and 30s once again cheered Soviet-American disarmament agreements during the Cold War. Conversely, there was hysteria when President Ronald Reagan began building up American military forces in the 1980s. Cries were heard that he was leading us toward nuclear war. In reality, he led us toward an end of the Cold War without a shot being fired at the Soviet Union. But who reads history these days or checks facts before leading the charge to keep law-abiding people disarmed? Now, Dr. Thomas Sowell likes to talk about the term diversity, as do I. I don't like it when I have to deal with the term diversity, but it's there. And we are being fed up to the gills with it. Dr. Sowell is another one who doesn't much care for the whole concept of diversity. A lot of social critics have called Dr. Sowell some sort of a traitor to his race because he is a black man, and yet he has these views that are considered rather conservative. Here he is talking about diversity. Here is Dr. Thomas Sowell again. All over the world, this magic word is used to uphold subjective criteria that disadvantage certain people. Nothing so epitomizes the politically correct gullibility of our times as the magic word diversity. The wonders of diversity are proclaimed from the media, extolled in the academy, and confirmed in the august chambers of the Supreme Court of the United States. But have you ever seen one speck of hard evidence to support the lofty claims? Although diversity has become one of the leading buzzwords of our time, it has a history that goes back several generations. In the early 20th century, the principle of geographic diversity was used to conceal bias against Jews in the admission of students to Harvard and other leading academic institutions. Because the Jewish population was concentrated in New York and other East Coast communities at that time, quota limits on how many Jewish students would be admitted were concealed by saying that Harvard wanted a diverse student body consisting of students from around the country. Therefore, some highly qualified Jewish applicants could be passed over in favor of less qualified applicants from the Midwest or other regions of the country. My own first encounter with the idea of geographic diversity occurred more than half a century ago when I was an undergraduate at Harvard and worked as a photographer for the university news office in order to help pay the bills. The instructions I was given were to concentrate on taking photos of students from other parts of the country rather than from the East Coast, from which Harvard already received more than enough applicants. The idea was to encourage applications from places that would produce a geographically diverse student body. It struck me as an odd idea at the time, but I was being paid to take pictures, not to make university policy. Moreover, I had no idea how such a policy had originated, and by the 1950s it might have been continued from inertia, from all I know. Meanwhile, I could enjoy seeing publicity photos I took appearing in newspapers in Chicago and elsewhere beyond the East Coast. Fast forward to today. It's common at colleges and universities across the country for the test scores of Asian American students who have been admitted to a given college to be higher than the test scores of whites or blacks or of Hispanics. But what justifies diversity? Nothing but unsupported assertions, repeated endlessly, piously, and loudly. That may not seem strange since that is true of test scores in general, but at any given institution, applying the same standards to all, the test scores of students at a particular institution would tend to be similar. More Asian Americans would be admitted to higher ranked colleges and universities, however, if the same standards were applied to all. In short, something very much like the quota limits that were applied to Jews in the past are now being applied to Asian Americans, and once again are being justified by diversity. But what justifies diversity? Nothing but unsupported assertions repeated endlessly, piously, and loudly. Today, as in the past, diversity is essentially a fancy word for group quotas. It is one of a number of wholly subjective criteria, such as quote-unquote leadership, used to admit students to colleges and universities according to their group membership, rather than according to their individual qualifications. This is not something new, nor is it something confined to the United States. Very similar patterns were found more than a decade ago when doing research for my book, Affirmative Action Around the World. In India, the court's attempts to rein in some academic quotas were met by a proliferation of new and wholly subjective admissions criteria. Individuals from groups that were not as qualified by objective criteria were simply ranked higher on subjective criteria and admitted. In the United States, the Supreme Court itself has long been part of such game playing when it comes to affirmative action. Back in 1978, an opinion by Justice Lewis F. Powell banned racial quotas with one hand and created diversity as a criterion with the other. In other words, colleges were told, in effect, that they can have racial quotas, but they just can't call them racial quotas. According to the Constitution, we the people are supposed to decide what laws and policies we live under, but not if we can be so easily fooled by courts using slippery words like diversity. Now, stepping aside and speaking for myself, I would have to say that when Dr. Samuel Johnson, maybe 300 years ago, remarked that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, he completely overlooked the immense possibilities of the word diversity. But that's just one man's opinion, worth exactly what you're paying for it. Now, I'd like to end by reading the last essay that Dr. Sowell wrote for the National Review at the end of 2016 before going into retirement. And it's just a general look back at a long life well lived by a man I very much admire. Once again, Dr. Thomas Sowell. Any honest man looking back on a very long life must admit, even if only to himself, being a relic of a bygone era. Having lived long enough to have seen both the greatest generation that fought World War II and the gratingest generation that we see all around us today, makes being a relic of the past more of a boast than an admission. Not everything in the past was admirable. Poet W.H. Auden called the 1930s a low, dishonest decade. So were the 1960s, which launched many of the trends we are experiencing so painfully today. Some of the fashionable notions of the 1930s reappeared in the 1960s, often using the very same discredited words and producing the same disastrous consequences. The old are not really smarter than the young in terms of sheer brain power. It's just that we have already made the kinds of mistakes that the young are about to make, and we have already suffered the consequences that the young are going to suffer if they disregard the record of the past. If you want to understand the fatal dangers facing America today, read The Gathering Storm by Winston Churchill. The book is not about America, the Middle East, or nuclear missiles, but it shows Europe's attitudes and delusions aimed at peace in the years before the Second World War, which instead ended up bringing on that most terrible war in all of human history. Black adults during the years when I was growing up in Harlem had far less education than black adults today, but far more common sense. In an age of artificial intelligence, too many of our schools and colleges are producing artificial stupidity among both blacks and whites. The first time I traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, as the plane flew into the skies over London, I was struck by the thought that in these skies, 1,000 British fighter pilots fought off Hitler's Air Force and saved both Britain and Western civilization. But how many students today will have any idea of such things without history being neglected in favor of politically correct rhetoric? You cannot live a long life without having been forced to change your mind many times about people and things, including, in some cases, your whole view of the world. Those who glorify the young today do them a great disservice when this sends inexperienced young people out into the world cocksure about things on which they have barely scratched the surface. In my first overseas trip, I was struck by blatantly obvious differences in behavior among groups, such as the Malays and the Chinese in Malaysia, and wondered why scholars who were far more well-traveled than I seemed to not have noticed such things, and seemed to have resorted to all sorts of esoteric theories to explain why some groups earned higher incomes than others. There are words that were once common, but that are seldom heard anymore. The phrase, "none of your business," is one of these. Today, everything seems to be the government's business or the media's business. And the word risque would be almost impossible to explain to young people in a world where gross vulgarity is widespread and widely accepted. Back when I taught at UCLA, I was constantly amazed at how little so many students knew. Finally, I could no longer restrain myself from asking a student the question that had long puzzled me. What were you doing for the last 12 years before you got here? Reading about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and the widespread retrogressions of Western civilization that follows was an experience that was sobering, if not crushing. Ancient history in general lets us know how long human beings have been the way they are, and dampens giddy zeal for the latest panaceas, despite how politically correct those panaceas may be. When I was growing up, we were taught the stories of people whose inventions and scientific discoveries had expanded the lives of millions of other people. Today, students are being taught to admire those who complain, who denounce, who demand. The first column I ever wrote 39 years ago was titled The Prophets of Doom. This was long before Al Gore made millions of dollars promoting global warming hysteria. Back in 1970, the prevailing hysteria was the threat of a new ice age, promoted by some of the same environmentalists who are promoting global warming hysteria today. And that, my friends, is Dr. Thomas Sowell. As I say, probably one of the, if not the wisest public figure in America today. I strongly advise you to look for his books, check them out at the library, buy them if you like. They will look very impressive on your bookshelf. Read them and absorb his ideas. You will be glad you did. Dr. Thomas Sowell is one of just a few intellectuals who are largely overlooked by the general populace because they contradict the liberal progressive narrative. Another pedagogue who is often overlooked by the general public is Professor John McWhorter. Another, of course, he's dead now, is William F. Buckley Jr., but his work is still well worth reading. A great many intellectuals are not what you'd call progressive, but I suppose that's just a function of their being very, very smart. And one of those, as I hope you've come to appreciate by this reading, is Dr. Thomas Sowell. Once again, that's S-O-W-E-L-L. Look him up, Google him, find him at the library, read his stuff. You'll be glad you did. And that's all for this evening's show. I'm Joseph Dobrian. Thank you for listening.